I stood outside a glass conference room holding a visitor badge when I heard my son-in-law laugh and say, "Don't worry about him," my son-in-law said, his voice carrying through the glass walls before I even saw him. "He's just a worthless old man who married into nothing. A relic." Laughter followed. Quick, practiced, the kind that came from people who didn't think the subject of the joke was close enough to hear it. I stood there holding a temporary visitor badge, my name printed too small beneath the bold word guest, and felt the sound of their amusement settle into my chest like dust. I didn't move. I didn't cough or shuffle my feet. I let the moment pass exactly as it wanted to, already aware that this wouldn't end the way he assumed. Even then, as the laughter faded and the meeting resumed, I understood there would be a consequence to this, one I wouldn't announce and one he wouldn't see coming. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's not an accident. Disrespect often hides behind confidence until consequences arrive. If you believe dignity doesn't expire with age, and boundaries matter more than approval, subscribe, like, and share. Someone you know needs this reminder. I took a slow breath and looked down at the badge clipped to my jacket, the plastic cool against my fingers. It was a strange thing, how easily years of experience could be flattened into a single label when context was removed. Guest. That was all I was to them in that moment. Temporary, inconsequential, easily dismissed. I reminded myself to keep walking, to follow the receptionist's earlier directions as if nothing had happened. The hallway smelled faintly of new carpet and expensive coffee, the kind meant to suggest importance without warmth. As I passed framed mission statements and glossy photos of smiling executives, I felt the familiar tug of invisibility that came with age, the quiet assumption that relevance expired alongside youth. 2 weeks earlier, my daughter had asked me to stop by her husband's firm while I was in the city. She'd framed it casually, almost apologetically, saying he'd love to show me around, and that it might be good for us to spend time together in his world. I'd agreed without hesitation, not because I was eager, but because I believed proximity still mattered. I'd worn a simple suit, nothing flashy, nothing that invited attention. That choice felt heavier now, as if modesty had been mistaken for absence. Standing outside that conference room, I wondered how many other assumptions he'd made about me, and how comfortable he'd been sharing them when he thought I wasn't listening. A phone buzzed somewhere down the hall, pulling me back into motion. I stepped away from the glass and followed the corridor to the waiting area, where a row of sleek chairs faced a wall-mounted screen cycling through quarterly achievements. I sat down carefully, placing my briefcase at my feet, and watched numbers climb in animated graphs meant to impress. No one acknowledged me. Assistants passed by with tablets tucked under their arms, conversations clipped and efficient. I caught fragments of jargon, deliverables, synergy, projections, and felt the faint irony of understanding it all while being treated as if I didn't belong. That irony wasn't bitter yet. It was observational, the kind that sharpened focus rather than dulling it. As I waited, I replayed his words in my mind, not to savor the insult, but to understand the confidence behind it. People didn't speak that way without certainty, certainty that their version of the world was complete, that no missing information could disrupt it. He believed he knew who I was. He believed he knew where power sat. And he believed, most dangerously, that respect flowed in only one direction. I glanced at my watch, noting the time, and thought briefly of the last board meeting I'd attended the week before. Different building, different tone, same polished surfaces. Titles changed depending on who was speaking them. That was a lesson I'd learned long ago, one he hadn't yet been forced to confront. A receptionist approached, her smile professional and rehearsed, and asked if I needed anything. I told her I was fine, thanked her, and watched as she returned to her desk. The small interruption grounded me, a reminder that this wasn't a memory or a metaphor. It was happening now, in real time. Somewhere behind the glass, my son-in-law was continuing his presentation, unaware that his words had already reshaped the room for me. I didn't feel the urge to storm in or demand an apology. Confrontation, I'd learned, often robbed moments of their clarity. Sometimes the most revealing response was patience, especially when someone was busy exposing themselves. My thoughts drifted, briefly, to my daughter. I wondered where she was in all of this, how she spoke about me when I wasn't around, whether she knew how casually he dismissed me to others. The question wasn't accusatory, it was reflective. Families had a way of smoothing over discomfort until it hardened into habit. I'd allowed that before, choosing peace over precision, assuming time would correct what I didn't. Sitting there now, I recognized that this visit wasn't accidental. It was an intersection, a place where assumptions met reality. I didn't yet know what would be asked of me, but I sensed that something irreversible would follow, not out of spite, but out of necessity. The meeting behind the glass ended with the scrape of chairs and a swell of voices. The door opened, and people filed out, my son-in-law among them, laughing as he checked his phone. He glanced in my direction and offered a thin smile, the kind reserved for obligations rather than affection. "Hey," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the hallway. "Didn't think you'd actually make it this early." I returned the smile, neutral and contained, and said nothing more than a greeting. He didn't invite me into conversation or introduce me to anyone. He didn't need to. In his mind, my role had already been assigned. As he turned back to his colleagues, I stood and adjusted my jacket, feeling the weight of the room shift subtly around me. No one noticed. Not yet. I picked up my briefcase and followed the group at a respectful distance, aware that the next door we entered would change the tone of the day. I hadn't come to assert myself. I hadn't come to correct him. But I knew, deeply, unmistakably, that by the time this visit ended, the story he told about me would no longer survive contact with the truth. And I was prepared to let that lesson unfold without interruption. "So," my son-in-law said, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who believed the room belonged to him, "what exactly do you do these days?" The question came wrapped in a half-smile, delivered just loudly enough for the others nearby to hear. We were seated in a smaller conference room now, not the main one with the glass walls, but an auxiliary space meant for overflow and observation. A place where people sat when they weren't essential. I noticed how he didn't introduce me, didn't use my name, didn't offer context. I also noticed how the others glanced at me briefly, then back at him, already taking their cues. I answered calmly, vaguely, and watched his smile sharpen, not because he understood, but because he thought he didn't need to. I told him I stayed busy. That was all. No titles, no history, no clarifications. He nodded as if that confirmed something he'd already decided, then launched into a story about a recent deal, peppered with jargon and self-congratulation. I listened without interrupting, noting how easily confidence filled the gaps left by ignorance. What struck me wasn't his arrogance. It was how unexamined it was. He didn't see himself as dismissive. He saw himself as realistic, as someone who understood how hierarchies worked. In his mind, relevance was visible, measurable, announced. Anything quiet, anything restrained, might as well not exist at all. A junior associate interrupted briefly to ask a procedural question, then apologized to my son-in-law for the interruption. The deference was subtle but consistent, and I saw how it fed him. Power, I'd learned, often grew fastest in environments where no one questioned its source. As the conversation resumed, I became aware of the assumptions stacking up around me, about my age, my usefulness, my proximity to decision-making. None of them were voiced directly, but all of them shaped the way I was treated. I didn't resent it. I studied it. There was a difference, and understanding that difference had saved me more than once in my life. At one point, he gestured toward me again and joked that it was nice of me to come out and see how the real world worked these days. A few people laughed politely. One didn't. I caught the flicker of discomfort in her expression before it vanished behind professionalism. That moment mattered more than the joke itself. It told me not everyone shared his certainty. Some people sensed the imbalance, even if they didn't yet understand it. I made a mental note of that, filing it alongside other small observations that would later form a clearer picture. Suspicion, I was learning, didn't arrive fully formed. It accumulated quietly, detail by detail. As the meeting progressed, I noticed how often he spoke for others, how rarely he deferred, how confidently he claimed credit. These were habits, not performances. He'd built an identity around being the smartest voice in the room, and no one had challenged it recently enough to make him cautious. I wondered how long he'd been like this at home, how often my daughter absorbed that tone without comment, how often she'd smoothed it over the way families do when success becomes a shield. The thought didn't make me angry. It made me attentive. There was a difference between being unaware of your power and being careless with it, and I was beginning to see where he fell. Midway through, an assistant stepped in to confirm logistics for the next session. She addressed my son-in-law directly, ignoring me entirely, then paused as if realizing she should acknowledge the extra person in the room. She nodded politely and left. The exchange was brief, forgettable to anyone else, but it reinforced something I couldn't ignore. My presence had been framed as incidental from the moment I walked in. That framing hadn't come from me. It had come from him. And once a narrative like that was established, it shaped every interaction that followed, unless something disrupted it. When the meeting adjourned, he stood and clapped his hands together, energized, already moving on to the next thing. "You can tag along if you want," he said to me, not unkindly, but without warmth. "We've got a leadership session next. Might be boring for you, but hey, good exposure." The phrasing lingered. Exposure. As if I were the one being introduced to something new, something above my station. I agreed with a nod, not because I needed to be there, but because I wanted to see how far his assumptions extended and what would happen when they reached their limit. As we walked down the hall, I reflected on how often people mistook silence for insignificance. I'd used that mistake to my advantage before, letting others overplay their hand while I observed. There was a discipline to it, one that required restraint rather than reaction. I felt it now, steady and familiar. I didn't yet know how this day would end, but I knew this much. His confidence wasn't rooted in knowledge. It was rooted in unchecked belief. And beliefs like that, once exposed, tended to collapse under their own weight. We stopped outside a larger conference room, doors closed, voices audible inside. A plaque beside the entrance listed the meeting title and attendees. I read it carefully, recognizing names, noting absences. My son-in-law glanced at it too, straightened his jacket, and took a breath, the way people do before stepping into what they believe is their arena. He looked back at me briefly, as if remembering I was there, then turned toward the door. As it opened, I felt the atmosphere shift, not dramatically, not yet, but enough to signal that the next few moments would matter. I followed him inside, suspicion fully formed now, and waited for the room to reveal what he hadn't bothered to ask. The door opened, and the room stood up. Almost all at once, chairs scraping back in a sudden, unified motion that carried more meaning than any greeting could have. Almost all. My son-in-law remained seated for a beat too long, still adjusting his cuff, still mid-thought, his confidence assuming continuity where there was none. I felt the shift before he did, the subtle recalibration of energy that happens when hierarchy asserts itself without announcement. No one spoke my name yet. No one needed to. I paused just inside the doorway, allowing the moment to complete itself, aware that the silence was already doing the work I hadn't come to do. Even then, I knew this pause would echo later, long after the meeting ended. As the executives settled back into their seats, I took mine at the far end of the table, not the head, not the center, but a place that allowed observation without intrusion. My son-in-law glanced around, confusion flickering across his face before smoothing itself into something practiced. He leaned toward a colleague and whispered something I couldn't hear, likely an attempt to reassert control over a room that had subtly slipped out of alignment. I kept my posture relaxed, hands folded, eyes attentive. This wasn't about dominance. It was about allowing truth to surface in its own time, without force or spectacle. The meeting began with routine updates, voices measured, slides advancing with quiet efficiency. I listened, recognizing patterns, noting who deferred and who interrupted, who spoke with substance and who filled space. My son-in-law spoke early and often, his tone confident, his assertions bold. He gestured toward charts, made jokes that landed unevenly, and glanced at me once or twice, as if to confirm I was still just an observer. What he didn't realize was that observation, when informed, carried its own weight. I wasn't there to be impressed. I was there to understand what he'd built and how it rested on assumptions no one had challenged. Midway through the session, an assistant entered quietly and handed a folder to the senior executive at the head of the table. A few words were exchanged in low tones, and then the executive nodded and looked down the table in my direction. The room seemed to inhale collectively. My son-in-law followed the gaze, his expression shifting from confidence to uncertainty, as if he'd suddenly realized there was a variable he hadn't accounted for. I met the executive's eyes and inclined my head slightly, nothing more. The exchange was brief, almost invisible, but it carried recognition, the kind that didn't need explanation. Before we continue, the executive said, clearing his throat, I'd like to acknowledge our guest today. He gestured toward me, and for the first time since I'd entered the building, the room's attention settled fully in my direction. I felt no rush of adrenaline, no satisfaction, only a quiet awareness that the narrative my son-in-law had been telling, about me, about himself, about where power lived, was about to encounter resistance. The executive paused, just long enough to let the moment stretch, then continued. It's not every day we have the opportunity to hear from someone with this level of perspective. My son-in-law's jaw tightened. He smiled reflexively, nodding along, but the movement lacked conviction. He didn't know what was happening yet, not fully, but he sensed the shift. I could see it in the way he straightened, the way his hands stilled on the table. The room wasn't hostile. It was attentive. And that, I knew, was more unsettling than outright opposition. Attention demanded accountability. It asked questions even when none were spoken. The executive invited me to share any observations I had, framing it as optional, respectful. I declined politely, saying I preferred to listen. That answer seemed to satisfy him, but it unsettled others, particularly my son-in-law. He glanced at me again, this time with something closer to suspicion than dismissal. He was trying to place me, to reconcile the version of me he'd mocked with the one the room was now accommodating. That reconciliation would prove impossible. Identities built on assumption rarely survived contact with context. As the meeting progressed, I noticed how the tone shifted. People spoke more carefully, chose words with intention. The casual bravado my son-in-law had displayed earlier softened into something more measured. He deferred where he hadn't before, listened longer, spoke less. No one corrected him overtly. No one needed to. The recalibration was happening organically, driven by an unspoken recognition that the room's hierarchy was more complex than he'd assumed. Watching it unfold, I felt a familiar restraint settle over me, the discipline of allowing consequences to educate where confrontation would only provoke defensiveness. Near the end of the session, the executive mentioned a follow-up discussion and referred to me again, this time with a title that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. The word hovered in the air, almost uttered, then deferred, as if intentionally saved for later. I understood the choice. Timing mattered. Revelation, when rushed, lost its instructional value. As the meeting adjourned and chairs scraped back once more, I rose with the others, meeting my son-in-law's eyes briefly. There was a question there now, unspoken but urgent. I offered him nothing in response. No reassurance, no correction, just patience, because I knew the next introduction wouldn't be mine to control, and when it came, it would change everything he thought he knew about me, about himself, and about the cost of speaking too freely when you believed no one important was listening. The room hadn't fully settled before it happened. Chairs were still half pushed in, conversations tapering off into low murmurs, when the senior executive stepped forward and extended his hand toward me with a smile that was both practiced and sincere. Mr. Chairman, he said clearly, his voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room. Thank you for joining us today. The words didn't echo, but they landed heavily, as if the air itself had thickened around them. I took his hand, returned the smile, and nodded. That was all. No speech. No clarification. I didn't need to look at my son-in-law to know what was happening behind me. The silence told me everything. Silence always did. When I finally did glance in his direction, I saw the color drain from his face in stages, disbelief giving way to calculation, calculation to something closer to fear. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, as if he were testing responses that no longer fit the moment. Around him, colleagues shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at me with new interest, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Power had a way of reorganizing rooms instantly, revealing alliances and insecurities without asking permission. I felt no satisfaction watching it happen, only confirmation. The assumptions he'd built his confidence on were collapsing, and there was nothing I needed to do to accelerate it. Someone cleared their throat. Another executive apologized for not recognizing me earlier. I waved it off gently, signaling that no correction was necessary. The meeting resumed briefly, but the tone had changed irreversibly. My son-in-law spoke once more, his voice careful now, stripped of its earlier bravado. Each sentence sounded rehearsed, filtered, as if he were afraid of tripping over words that might expose him further. I listened, not to judge his performance, but to observe how quickly certainty evaporated when context was restored. It was instructive, even for me. As the session wrapped up, the executive suggested we continue the discussion later and gestured toward the door. People filed out slowly, some offering nods or brief greetings, others murmuring apologies that felt more reflexive than sincere. My son-in-law lingered, clearly unsure whether to approach me or disappear. I watched the conflict play out across his face, the internal scramble to reconcile the man he'd mocked with the authority he now understood I held. That reconciliation would take time, if it happened at all. In the hallway, he finally caught up to me. I didn't realize, he began, his voice low, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. If I had known, I never would have. I stopped walking and turned to face him fully for the first time that day. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt. I simply looked at him until he trailed off on his own. That's exactly the problem, I said evenly. You shouldn't need to know. The words weren't sharp, but they landed with precision. I saw him flinch, not from insult, but from recognition. He nodded, muttered something that sounded like an apology, and stepped back, suddenly unsure of his footing. Later, in a quieter corner of the building, my daughter approached me. She looked tired, conflicted, caught between roles she hadn't realized were incompatible until now. She asked if I was okay, if everything had gone all right. I told her the truth, that I was fine, and that things had unfolded exactly as they needed to. She searched my face for anger and found none, which seemed to unsettle her more than outrage would have. We spoke briefly, cautiously, as if navigating a room filled with fragile objects. When she left, I knew she carried questions she wasn't ready to ask. By the time I exited the building, the afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across the plaza. My phone buzzed with messages, some congratulatory, some awkwardly apologetic, some silent notifications of people who'd suddenly found reason to reach out. I didn't respond. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stood for a moment, breathing in the cool air. The fallout had begun, but it wasn't explosive. It was quiet, procedural, unavoidable. The kind of fallout that didn't destroy everything at once, but altered trajectories permanently. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I replayed the day not with triumph, but with a careful honesty. I thought about how easily respect had been extended once a title was spoken, and how little it had mattered before. I thought about my son-in-law's laughter, the certainty behind it, and how quickly that certainty had unraveled. Power, I realized again, didn't need to announce itself loudly. It only needed to exist long enough for others to recognize it. And recognition, once forced, left scars deeper than confrontation ever could. I knew there would be conversations ahead, explanations demanded, narratives reframed, boundaries tested. But I also knew something else, something steadier. I hadn't come to that firm to be acknowledged. I hadn't come to correct or to punish. I'd come because I believed proximity still mattered. What I left with was clarity. Proximity without respect was just another form of distance. And whatever came next would not be about asserting authority, but about deciding how much access someone deserved once they'd shown me exactly who they were when they thought it didn't matter. I didn't know who you were, my son-in-law said later that evening, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the confidence he usually wore like armor. We were sitting across from each other in a quiet corner of a restaurant my daughter had suggested, neutral ground she hoped might soften what had already hardened. He kept his eyes on the table as he spoke, fingers tracing the rim of his glass, as if searching for something solid to hold on to. If I had known you were the chairman, I would have acted differently. That was when the truth finally surfaced, not the one he intended to confess, but the one he didn't realize he was revealing. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words settle, understanding in that moment that this conversation was no longer about an insult overheard in a hallway. It was about the conditions under which he believed respect was owed. I didn't respond right away. Silence had become my ally that day, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. I watched him grow uncomfortable beneath it, watched him rush to fill the space with explanations that only deepened the divide. He talked about stress, about culture, about how that's just how people joke in competitive environments. Each justification circled the same center: behavior excused by context, cruelty softened by ambition. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, measured, deliberate. I told him the title hadn't changed who I was. It had only changed how he saw me. And that distinction mattered more than any apology he could offer. My daughter sat between us, her posture rigid, hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked from him to me, then back again, as if hoping one of us would say something that would resolve the tension cleanly. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the loyalty split between the man she'd married and the father she'd grown up with. I didn't envy her position. I'd made compromises like that once, believing harmony was worth the quiet erosion of self-respect. I knew now how wrong that belief had been. Watching her struggle with it reminded me why boundaries, once crossed, demanded clarity rather than comfort. He apologized again, this time more directly, acknowledging that his words had been inappropriate. But even as he spoke, I sensed the limit of his understanding. The apology wasn't rooted in remorse for disrespect. It was rooted in embarrassment at having misjudged the room. I asked him a simple question then, one he didn't expect. I asked how he would have treated me if I'd truly been what he assumed, a retired, ordinary man with no title, no leverage, no authority. He hesitated, then said he would have still been polite. The pause before his answer told me everything his words didn't. The rest of the dinner passed in careful conversation, none of it reaching the surface of what had been exposed. When we parted, there were promises to talk again, to clear the air, to move forward. I nodded, offered polite goodbyes, and walked away knowing that something fundamental had shifted. Respect offered retroactively, once status was revealed, wasn't respect at all. It was compliance. And compliance dissolved the moment the power dynamic changed again. I had no interest in living inside that cycle. Over the next few days, messages came in from colleagues at the firm. Some congratulating me, others apologizing for misunderstandings. I responded briefly where necessary, declining invitations to intervene or reassure. Behind the professionalism, I sensed a collective recalibration underway. My son-in-law's standing hadn't collapsed, but it had changed. People spoke to him differently now, watched him more closely. He'd been revealed not as malicious, but as careless with power he hadn't fully earned. In corporate environments, that distinction mattered. It followed you quietly, reshaping opportunities without announcing itself. My daughter called one evening, her voice tight with frustration and sadness. She asked if I could let this go, if I could reassure him that things were fine. I listened, then told her the truth gently, that things were clear, not fine. I explained that I wasn't angry, but I wasn't willing to pretend nothing had been learned. She accused me, not unkindly, of making things harder than they needed to be. I told her clarity often felt that way at first. The call ended without resolution, but not without understanding. At least, I hoped so. Alone later that night, I reflected on how often people confused forgiveness with access. Forgiveness, I'd learned, was internal. It freed you from carrying resentment. Access was different. Access was a privilege, granted based on trust and behavior. My son-in-law had apologized, and I believed he meant it as far as he was capable. But apology didn't erase revelation. It didn't restore the version of him I thought I knew before I heard his laughter through that glass wall. and it didn't obligate me to pretend that revelation hadn't changed how I saw him. By the end of the week, the urgency around the incident had faded for everyone but me. Life moved on. Meetings were scheduled. Deals progressed. At home, the quiet felt heavier than usual, filled with thoughts I hadn't yet resolved. I knew a decision was forming, not dramatic, not retaliatory, but final. It wasn't about punishing him or asserting dominance. It was about deciding what kind of relationship I was willing to maintain with someone who measured worth by proximity to power. That decision, I understood, would define the boundary I set, not just with him, but with myself. I didn't remove him from the company. That was what everyone seemed to expect. The dramatic act, the swift correction, the story people could whisper about in hallways and retell at dinners. Power, after all, was supposed to look like punishment when it revealed itself. Instead, I did something quieter, something far more permanent. I stepped back. I withdrew the invisible scaffolding that had supported him without his knowledge, the unspoken endorsements, the casual protections, the patience I'd extended because he was family. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten it. I simply stopped intervening. And in doing so, I let him stand on exactly what he'd built, no more and no less. The decision didn't come all at once. It settled over several days, crystallizing slowly as I replayed conversations, remembered expressions, revisited that laugh I'd heard through the glass wall. I thought about how easily he'd dismissed me when he believed I was harmless, how quickly his tone had shifted when he learned otherwise. That contrast mattered more than the insult itself. It told me that his respect was transactional, conditional on status rather than character. I couldn't undo that knowledge. I also couldn't unlearn what it felt like to be reduced so casually. Boundaries, I realized, weren't reactions to anger. They were responses to clarity. At the firm, nothing outwardly dramatic changed at first. Meetings continued. Projects advanced. But subtly, deliberately, I altered my involvement. I stopped offering strategic guidance unless it was formally requested. I declined invitations where my presence would have smoothed tensions or strengthened his position by association. When his name came up in discussions about future leadership, I listened without advocating. Not against him, just not for him. It was remarkable how quickly the absence of quiet support created space for others to be seen, and scrutiny to settle where it belonged. I hadn't taken anything from him. I'd simply stopped giving what he hadn't known he was receiving. My daughter noticed before he did. She asked why I seemed more distant, why I no longer asked about his projects or offered advice. I told her the truth, gently and without accusation. I said I was allowing their lives to be fully their own, without my shadow influencing outcomes. She frowned, sensing the deeper implication even if she couldn't yet articulate it. Distance, when chosen rather than imposed, unsettled people. It forced them to confront what they'd been leaning on. I watched her wrestle with that realization, and though it hurt, I didn't step in to ease it. Some lessons needed room to unfold. Weeks passed. The incident became old news, replaced by the next urgency, the next distraction. But the effects lingered. My son-in-law grew quieter in meetings, more cautious. Opportunities he'd assumed would come his way didn't materialize as easily. He worked harder, stayed later, questioned himself in ways he hadn't before. I didn't celebrate that. Growth born of discomfort wasn't something to applaud prematurely, but I also didn't rescue him from it. He was learning, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to operate without borrowed authority. Whether he resented me for that, or eventually understood it was no longer my concern. One evening, alone in my study, I reflected on how aging had changed my relationship with power. When I was younger, power felt like something to wield, to prove, to defend. Now, it felt more like something to steward, to use sparingly, intentionally, with an awareness of its impact. Being called Mr. Chairman hadn't restored my dignity. I'd never lost it. What restored something, unexpectedly, was choosing not to use that title as a shield or a weapon. I'd been mocked as a worthless old man, and instead of refuting the insult directly, I'd allowed time and truth to do the work. That choice felt like reclaiming myself. I thought, too, about respect, how often it was confused with fear, obedience, or admiration. Real respect, I'd learned, was how you treated people when nothing compelled you to be kind. It was how you spoke when you believed no one important was listening. By that measure, my son-in-law had failed me long before I overheard him. The overheard words were just confirmation. Accepting that freed me from the need to fix him or the relationship. I didn't need him to see me differently anymore. I needed to see myself clearly and act accordingly. Months later, at a family gathering, he approached me cautiously, more reserved than before. We spoke politely, even cordially. There was no tension, but there was no intimacy either. The ease that once existed, perhaps imagined more than real, was gone. And that was all right. Not every relationship needed to be repaired to be resolved. Some needed to be redefined, placed within limits that honored reality rather than nostalgia. I treated him with basic respect, the kind owed to any person. I no longer extended the grace reserved for those who understood its value. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, my daughter hugged me tightly. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask me to explain myself again. She simply held on a moment longer than usual, and when she pulled back, her eyes were clearer than they'd been in months. I knew then that whatever strain this had introduced, it had also introduced honesty. That mattered. Families, like institutions, survived not on comfort alone, but on truth spoken, or lived, when it was hardest. Now, looking back, I understand that day at the firm wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about the moment you realize your worth doesn't require recognition to exist. I didn't need to correct the insult out loud. I didn't need to demand respect from someone who only offered it conditionally. I needed to decide where my energy belonged and where it didn't. That was the final boundary, and I kept it, not loudly, not publicly, but firmly. If this story stayed with you, it's probably because you've seen how easily people measure worth by titles, age, or proximity to power. Maybe you've been dismissed when someone thought you didn't matter. Or maybe you've been on the other side, assuming too much based on too little. Either way, remember this: dignity doesn't need an audience, and boundaries don't need applause. Sometimes the strongest response is simply choosing not to save someone from the consequences of who they decided to be.